autistic people, rather than just following social conventions, this is what I've been told and that's good enough, they're questioning. We can all play our part. I think that's the point.
So welcome to the Beautiful Reality of Autism, the podcast where we talk to thought leaders and specialists in the world of autism, and also to parents of autistic children and autistic people themselves who have gone on to make a big difference. The aim of the podcast is to give parents who are bringing up autistic children hope, inspiration, understanding, and to empower them to create the sorts of trust-based, nurturing relationships with them that will help them to unlock their full potential. Today, we're honoured to be joined by someone who's at the forefront of research into autism and has been for the past 40 years or so. One of the most respected voices in autism, Simon Baron-Cohen, now Sir Simon Baron-Cohen of the University of Cambridge. So hello, Simon. It's great to be with you again.
Hi, Guy. Thank you very much for inviting me into your studio.
Yeah, a virtual studio today. And it's been a very long time since we've spoken, certainly on one of these recorded interviews. And normally at the end of each conversation, I ask 3 questions. But I think in this case, 2 of them are going to form the main pillars of this conversation. The first one is the question of what is autism, because this is something that you've been, in the weeds of for the past few decades. And so we'll look at that. And the second question is, what does that research that you've done lead you to suggest to parents of autistic children to best optimize their relationships and the outcomes for those children? But before we go there, it might be a bit interesting just to have a very brief outline of what brought you to the field of autism in the first place. Was it a family connection? Was it something personal, or did it come about in some other way?
For me, as you mentioned, I've been in the field for 40 years, and I started as a teacher in a small school for autistic kids back in the early 80s. It was called Family Tree, and it was in North London in Barnet. And it had just 6 autistic children and 6 teachers. So I was privileged to be one of those 6 teachers. And you can hear from just that staff student or pupil ratio 1-to-1 that it was really intensive, like a sort of an incubator for getting to know half a dozen autistic kids in a lot of detail and getting to know their families. So the name of the school, the Family Tree, it welcomed families in. And it was at a time when we were really, wondering how we could help autistic kids. So there were video cameras in every classroom, on every wall, so that we could record every interaction between a teacher and a child to see what worked, but also what didn't work. And those videotapes, would be reviewed in staff meetings. So it was very experimental, run by a very pioneering head teacher called June Felton, who's now passed away, but I think, was way ahead of her time.
Yeah, it's extremely pioneering for the 1980s, wasn't it? And I guess that was very much at odds with the way that autism was understood at that time.
Theories of autism have changed a lot over the decades. At that time, we were barely out of the decades of parent blaming, thinking that parents were to blame for causing their child's autism, and the whole refrigerator mother theory, the idea that mothers in particular weren't providing the right emotional climate or environment for their child to develop sort of foundational relationships. And that was a kind of throwback to psychoanalytic theories of autism. And obviously over the decades, theories have changed. We now think of autism as neurodevelopmental, so a difference in the way the brain develops right from the beginning of life. Back then, we didn't really realize that autism was partly genetic. I think the first twin study of autism, where you compare identical and non-identical twins, in terms of what's the likelihood of the co-twin also being autistic if one twin is autistic. The first twin study was only in 1977, I think. And, since then, the whole field of autism genetics has really expanded so that we now know that there are over 100 genes that are associated with autism. And the field is continuing to do very important research. So a big shift, really, over the years.
Yeah, it's a huge change in understanding. Can we drill into it a little bit? So you
Yeah.
say that it's almost like, because it's an autism spectrum and it's so broad, and you say that it's about a difference between how autistic people and non-autistic people see the world in some way, or a neurological difference. What is that difference? How would you categorize that difference, and what is it that specifically that makes an autistic person autistic?
Right. So I like the way you phrased the question, which is focusing on differences. And maybe just before we dive into the detail, we should mention the word neurodiversity, because although that term was first proposed in the late 90s, and it's the idea that brains develop differently, it shouldn't come as a big surprise that all of us have, differences in the way our brains develop. And what that means is that, we all have a different profile of strengths and challenges. And the idea of diversity, neurodiversity, is picking up on similar concepts such as biodiversity. Why would you expect all plants or animals to be the same? Or gender diversity, where we recognize a spectrum in terms of gender identity, or ethnic diversity, where, differences are celebrated. So the same should be true for neurodiversity.
Yeah, definitely.
But going one step further, what that makes me think is that when we think about autism, we should think of it as an example of neurodiversity, but we don't want to gloss over the fact that part of those differences involve disability, and specifically disability in social relationships and in communication and in adjusting to unexpected change. So these are kids who get very stressed if routines change or if the world becomes unpredictable in some way. But the other side of autism, and picking up on this concept of differences, is differences in the way they process information. And some of those differences are strengths or even talents. So excellent attention to detail would be one example. That autistic kids and adults often focus on the small things that other people miss, and excellent memory for detail, excellent pattern recognition.
You've written a book about that, haven't you?
I did write a book in 2020 called The Pattern Seekers.
Yeah.
And just this idea that some people are much more drawn to patterns in the world, and autistic people seem to enjoy finding patterns and wanting to kind of verify patterns, often through repetitive observations or repetitive actions where you can see the same outcome each time. And again, thinking about how our understanding of autism has changed. Back in the 80s, autistic kids who showed repetitive behavior, that was seen as a very negative thing, and it was seen as something that should be discouraged, as if repetitive behavior or obsessional thinking would somehow limit the child's learning and experience. Today, we sort of see that as part of an autistic child's learning style, that they learn through repetition, and they learn through spotting, if you like, the anomalies when you don't always get the same outcome. So they're looking for when patterns are violated, not just when patterns are confirmed. And you could imagine, if we fast forward to autistic children growing up into adults and the world of work, that actually that kind of processing style could be a great advantage in lots of fields. Whether it's to do with, I don't know, making things or fixing things, where you think of the object as a system. It could be like fixing a bicycle or designing a new bicycle, but it's a system, and all the parts have to fit together in an elegant, harmonious whole. But for someone who's very good at spotting which components might either improve the system or be causing a problem in the system, that kind of attention to detail and pattern recognition could be a real asset.
And it's almost, isn't it? It's almost that, when people are in the world of work and they're not expected to behave in a certain way, or what you were saying about in the 1980s when repetitive behavior was discouraged, it was almost not recognizing the difference and not respecting the difference, wasn't it? And it was almost trying to force children to conform to something that, in the case of an autistic child, wasn't optimal for them and wasn't their natural way of learning. And I think you brought up neurodiversity. I think neurodiversity is one of the most paradigm shifting and empowering concepts that's come about for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really only in the last decade or so that it's that I've seen it being sort of common usage or common currency.
Now,
yeah.
So sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to bring in, because I've heard you say that while you're very much in favour of neurodiversity, you're not particularly, and I'm not either, in favour of using this word neurodivergent to describe people. And I wonder if you could say a bit about that as well.
I don't have very strong feelings about that. I think just you used the word, I think, sort of revolutionary, that this concept of neurodiversity is revolutionary because, and I agree with that. In fact, I wrote an editorial in one of the scientific journals about neurodiversity revolutionizing the field of psychiatry. But we could also imagine it revolutioning the field of education and of work, and neuroscience and all sorts of fields. But the reason I think it's revolutionary is that in the bad old days, we used to think about brains as either being normal or abnormal. Today, when we hear that word abnormal, it just sounds so pejorative. It's hard to believe that there were scientific journals called the Journal of Abnormal Psychology.
But even today, I mean, it's like any categorization that the medical establishment comes up with, they shove the word disorder onto the end of it. It's not that different still.
It's true, and that derives from the classification system that's created by the American Psychiatric Association. It's called DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So when you go to a clinic to get a diagnosis of autism, the clinician, whether it's a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist or pediatrician, they'll be using the DSM, the criteria. And the DSM does use the word disorder. So they talk about autism spectrum disorder or ASD. I'm certainly not a fan of that terminology because I think the word disorder is, it's quite stigmatizing. So I think a lot of autistic people feel that they're dealing with enough discrimination anyway in the world, being in a minority. Autism is more common than it was. It's about 3% of the population. But nevertheless, it means that the world is designed for the majority rather than the minority. And that's true whether we're talking about classroom design. Some autistic people won't necessarily learn optimally in a traditional classroom with 25 or 30 kids, quite noisy, expected to learn from listening to a teacher or looking at a teacher's facial expression, or working in small groups. Some autistic kids might prefer to learn in a quieter environment where things are a bit more under their control. There's fewer distractions, not having the background noise of other kids chatting or whispering or laughing when they're trying to learn something. And some kids autistic kids like to learn from first principles, that, they follow their own interests, but they want to really understand something from the first principles and build their knowledge upwards, rather than just being told by a teacher or being told even by a textbook, these are the facts.
Yeah, I find this myself. I've been in this situation so many times, right back from school. It's just like, even with stuff like calculus that I wasn't even, equipped to really understand the basics. It's almost like if I don't have the fundamentals, it's meaningless to me.
Yeah. But to me, it's also a very positive and refreshing quality that autistic people want to understand things for themselves. So they're asking those why questions. Why is it the case that the world is the way we think it is? Or they're asking how questions. How does something work? And they want to kind of figure it out for themselves or get some evidence. And in that way, I think autistic people, rather than just following social conventions, this is what I've been told and that's good enough, they're questioning, and just as we would expect, I don't know, from from a scientist, and some autistic people, their minds kind of lend themselves to a very scientific or analytic approach. You mentioned maths. Some autistic kids really, they flourish in the world of mathematics, where you can start from foundational principles and work upwards, and you can sort of study maths in your own private world, free from the distraction of all the social interaction.
Yeah, I mean, I often found at school that teachers thought that I was either an idiot or a genius, but it depended on the teacher. It depended on how the teacher taught. If they taught from fundamentals, I could, I'd get fully into it. If they taught from the top, just talking down and teaching you sort of rote learning and things to learn, I just switched off altogether, and I couldn't learn even the basics.
Yeah, and that sort of leads us on to another point about sort of autism and education, which is, that some autistic kids will appear as if they're not engaged, as if they're daydreaming or just unable to focus. And it may just be because of the way the information is being presented. So I suppose another big implication of this the revolutionary concept of neurodiversity, is we may need to tailor education in a much more individual way. That, if not all brains work in the same way, then we need to really think about what's best for this specific child. How do they learn, and what's the best way of supporting their learning? And that raises, financial or economic, resource issues. How do we actually resource that? But ultimately, if we don't do that, we end up with autistic kids dropping out of school, being unhappy at school, maybe leaving school without qualifications, despite the fact that they've got gifts and talents.
Being able to contribute less to society in the longer run, so it might actually end up being more expensive.
Yeah, and that's not to, we haven't even touched on the emotional consequences of that.
Yes.
Because ultimately, school isn't just about getting your qualifications and academic progress. It's also about being happy. We want to produce happy children and happy teenagers. And the big concern that I have from the research is that, there are very high rates of depression and anxiety in autistic people. And even more worrying is the rate of suicidal feelings and even suicidal attempts by autistic people. This isn't to sort of worry parents who might be listening, but it's just to kind of remind teachers and remind anyone who's involved with autistic kids that they need a bit of safeguarding to make sure that they end up flourishing rather than being sort of battered by the educational system.
Yeah. And so you're bringing out, with your work, the potential that autistic children have that is often unseen. And you're talking a lot about the strengths of autistic children. Now, you also call autism a disability.
Yeah.
And I understand why, and I'll tell you in a minute why I think you do.
Okay.
But many people we take a different perspective in our charity, for example, because when we say that there are disadvantages that come with autism, that's true, but the disadvantages don't come from autism itself. They come from demographics and, as you say, prejudice and discrimination. Maybe not intentional, but that's what's there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and if we're going to call autistic people disabled because they've got certain sort of social challenges that come as a result of that, it also makes sense to call non-autistic people disabled because of their relative disadvantages
Yeah.
compared to autistic people.
Yeah. So the reason I agree with almost everything you've said. The reason I would still hold out for using the term disability is that when we make the diagnosis, we want the diagnosis to be, if you like, a stepping stone or a passport into getting extra support. And, under the Equality Act, you're entitled to extra support if you have a disability. So it's not to focus in a disproportionate way on the things that autistic people find challenging, but it's just to kind of highlight that they do need extra support.
Yes, and that's true. And in a sense, from that perspective, it's good that people like you are calling it a disability, because the benefit system doesn't have the understanding of the nuances of what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, but I suppose where we both agree is that the individual shouldn't be defined by the disability, because that overlooks the other half of autism, which is these differences that are often strengths. I liked your use of the word respect earlier. You're talking about how increasingly autistic people, but society is kind of recognizing that autistic people deserve respect, respect for their differences, um, and acceptance of their differences, alongside support for their disability.
You talked a moment ago about the emotional side and the high rates of depression and even suicide attempts amongst autistic people. And I wonder if this is maybe a good point to pivot to the other main pillar of the conversation about parents and what parents can do to give children the foundations so that they don't end up on that side of
Yeah,
life.
yeah. Well, if we just sort of start with the grim statistics, the research is showing that probably the majority of autistic kids and teenagers and adults end up with poor mental health. So whether we think it's 60% or 70%, it's way too high. And that's probably a consequence of feeling like the world is not inclusive. Sometimes autistic kids experience being bullied at school, whether it's verbal bullying or physical bullying. And, that's toxic for a child's self-esteem, self-confidence. Um, yeah, and I think not being included can extend to things like not being invited to other children's birthday parties, or wanting a friend and not knowing how to make a friend or how to keep a friend, so feeling quite isolated. So I think there's a responsibility on, if you like, the non-autistic peer group to recognize that if there's a child in the class who's autistic, they should be reaching out. They should be making sort of accommodations or reasonable adjustments to say, well, maybe that child needs a buddy, or needs needs me or someone else in the class or in the school to be making the first move towards the child.
I think that's a really, really important point. Certainly for to help autistic children who go to mainstream schools, and a lot of mainstream schools, I think, or most mainstream schools, really struggle to facilitate that responsibility being taken by the non-autistic children. What
Yeah,
could they do?
yeah,
What can the school do, and what can parents do to empower the school to do that?
yeah. Well, we've talked a bit about neurodiversity, but I think schools can play their part in raising awareness of neurodiversity and then celebrating it. So if autistic kids, for example, don't like making eye contact, and that's true for some autistic kids, we shouldn't be putting pressure on them to do so. And if they don't like maybe public speaking, whatever it is that's causing them stress, but we can be focusing on the things that they do enjoy and that they do very well. And it could be, that some autistic kids love music, that they gravitate towards music again because there's the opportunity for repetition and for pattern recognition. And they might take to it like a duck to water, if that's an appropriate metaphor. But really sort of flourishing in the world of music, or it could be a different activity. It could be cooking, where a child loves the repetition of a recipe, or loves to experiment with recipes to make food taste even better. But whatever it is that the child's doing, the school has the opportunity to say how pleased they are that we've got an autistic child in our class or in our primary school. These days, autism is 1 in 30 kids. It's incredibly common. For reasons maybe we could talk about why the diagnosis rates have gone up.
I was sort of thinking, is it actually more common? I mean, it might be, or is it that it's more detected?
I think it's the latter, that we're just diagnosing it more often. We're kind of approaching the true rate in the population rather than there being.
And do you think we've hit? You think we're getting close, or do you think it might even be bigger? Because there's a lot of people who are not autistic, but a lot of very sensitive people who may not be autistic themselves, but who really feel comfortable with autistic people. And I wonder if there's a potential that there's more, that it could be expanded, or maybe it's expanded too much. What do you think?
No, I think that there are some people who worry, is there overdiagnosis? And I'm not one of those people. I think, if parents have made the effort to get their child diagnosed, and it's quite it's a journey full of obstacles and barriers, or if an adult has made the effort to seek a diagnosis, it's probably because they need one, that they're struggling in some way, and the diagnosis is there to help them, as we said earlier, or should be. So, and to your question about have we reached the maximum, as it were, for the prevalence of autism? I wouldn't be surprised if it carries on increasing. And I think that's a good thing, that we don't want a world where people who might need a diagnosis feel that they have to mask or hide their autism to try and fit in and try to be accepted. This concept of masking or camouflaging is another kind of recent, I think, positive way of thinking about autism, because we know that masking means that you're not really free to be yourself.
Yeah.
And that can also contribute to poor mental health.
Yes.
So rather than sort of pretending that you're not autistic, training yourself to behave in the way that non-autistic people behave, I think, that's not respectful. And part of what schools can do and employers can do is to say, we want autistic people to come out, using that language that we used to think of from the gay community. They don't need to hide their differences. They can feel proud of their differences. And we can design schools and workplaces with reasonable adjustments, which again is a right under the Equality Act. Reasonable adjustments to make schools and the workplace comfortable for autistic people.
And generally, what I find is that when you start to do that, and you start to make environments comfortable for autistic people, they actually become more comfortable for everybody. Actually, it's not like autistic people have needs that are totally different from everybody else's, but certain things they need much more.
Yeah. So back to what could parents be doing?
Yes.
And this whole question about mental health. the goal should be that the autistic kids should grow up happy. And at the moment, they're not. And that's probably a sign of how society is treating autistic people, that they still feel shut out. And if parents are keeping an eye on their autistic child's well-being, and the same for teachers, actually stopping to ask their child, how are you? And are there things we could be doing to make things easier for you? And the child might not know, so the parents might have to be a bit imaginative in terms, but just making time in the busy sort of day when you've got parents who are at work and coming home, and maybe noticing that the child is rather quiet and subdued, or upset about things, just finding out what's going on. Is there bullying, for example, going on at school? Even though schools claim that they have an anti-bullying policy, we know it does go on behind teachers' backs or outside the school gates. Just kind of making time to find out what the child needs. So
I think
that
that's so important, and this is entirely almost what we're focused on as a charity,
yeah,
helping, empowering families to almost create that sort of trust and that relationship where the parents can be trusted to hear what the
yeah,
child is saying, because
yeah,
so often, if we don't take that time out that you're talking about and really sort of focus on the child, put the phones away, just like really give the child 100% focus and listen and tune into what they're saying and sort of try to read what they're saying. If we don't do that, they can really easily feel misunderstood, and then they can get the impression, the understanding that we as parents are not trustworthy, and we're just an extra layer of the problem rather than part of the solution, which we can also be.
yeah. And what the research, just to continue that, that focus on the statistics, the kind of quite grim statistics. But what the research is showing is that 1 in 4 autistic adults will plan or attempt suicide.
It's tragic, isn't it?
It really is, and it should be sort of an alarm bell ringing, for government, but for all of us in society, to say, well, if we want to prevent these tragedies, you know, there's we can all play our part. I think that's the point. Whether
And
we're
if you
talking
if you
about,
think about what it would take just for one person to get to that state where they're thinking of ending their lives,
yeah,
and to sort of consider that we're doing that to a quarter of autistic children,
yeah,
it's sort of shocking, isn't it?
yeah, and those are the ones who plan or attempt. In our work, we've found if you ask the question, "Have you ever felt suicidal?" the rates are even higher. It might be 2/3 of autistic
Two
people.
thirds, seriously, gosh.
You know, so a lot of our research at the moment has pivoted to focus on this, because you might think of it as a mental health crisis in the autism community. And it's a reflection of lack of good quality support and a sense of exclusion and, feeling shut out. So, I think the solutions are probably not rocket science. They may need extra funding. And it's a concern that governments, not just in the UK, are not putting in the resources for good quality support for families as well as for the autistic
Yes,
themselves.
because the family is so crucial, isn't it? It's what it's the first, it's the ultimate fallback for the child. If the family is there, at least they've got something. They've got some sort of hope.
Yeah,
But families where the parents are not autistic, they need a bit of support. They need a bit of help. They need a bit of guidance to know what on earth to do. I'm autistic, but I still needed the guidance to know how to. And I was very lucky. We found a very, you know about the Mifni Center in Israel. We found that center that really changed everything for us. Without that guidance, things
yeah,
could have been very, very different for us.
yeah. And you talk about parents and how some parents are indeed autistic themselves and have a child who's autistic, and that kind of echoes back to the genetic part of autism. But also, if the parent is autistic, they may have their own challenges, because parenting isn't easy. especially if you've got several children in the family and each child's needs have to be juggled. Um, you know, so we have to look at what parents need as well, not just what the kids need.
Yeah. So would you say that would be the priority, at least in terms of public policy, to support parents and to sort of give families the guidance that they need to be able to support their children?
Yeah, if we go back to this link with suicide risk, the UK government have now recognised that autistic people are one of the high risk groups for autism. But we published data on this back in 2014, and it's only this year that they've now recognised autistic people as a high risk group. So things change way too.
You mean high risk for depression and suicide? You said high risk for autism. I don't know if it was a slip.
Sorry, that autistic people are high risk for suicide.
Yeah.
No, and it shouldn't have taken a decade. As soon as that data is published, we published it in a high-profile journal called The Lancet Psychiatry back in 2014 as a wake-up call to the government. If you leave autistic people without the right support, this is what happens. But nothing much has really changed. I mean, it's good that it's now that autistic people are now recognized as high risk for suicide, but we've got to go a lot further by putting real money, new money into resources. I know your charity is playing its part, but it shouldn't be just the philanthropic sector. It should be the statutory sector that's also funding this.
And in terms of families, are there any, and I don't want to put you on the spot or anything like that, but are there any words of inspiration or any sort of key takeaways or, really pertinent pieces of advice that you could give to families who are, maybe struggling to bring up their autistic children, struggling to create those positive relationships with them?
I think we've touched on this already, but if the child feels loved and feels valued, and feels supported by the parents, this is not to put sort of undue responsibility or pressure on parents, but I think it does make a big difference. Then even, whatever's going on at school, maybe by the peer group, if the parents are there to play that supportive role, we know that autistic kids can flourish. And, I would say that if you've got an autistic child who feels different, if you can point to role models, we talked about, let's say 2/3 of autistic adults who have poor mental health, but focus on the 1/3 who don't and look to see, point out to your child, this person's autistic and look what they're doing, just kind of to give hope, really.
Yeah. No, my son is a great admirer of Greta Thunberg, for example.
She's a great example. She struggled with her own mental health.
Yeah.
She had depression, that she dropped out of school famously, and she had an eating disorder. But she focused on what she found fascinating, which was the climate, and her autistic mind, her autistic brain, could really soak up all the details of the science of climate. The understanding the climate crisis. And I suppose her very forthright way of speaking meant that, she could say things to people in authority, to politicians, to policymakers, in a very direct way.
Because there was an authority and a sincerity there, wasn't there?
Yeah, but it's also not being intimidated by
yes.
just because this person is a prime minister or a president.
Yeah.
Autistic people often love to be quite direct and quite truthful. And so they're not going to sort of sugar the pill when they think something's wrong. If they think something's wrong, they'll say it. And so it's, there's so many positive qualities to autistic people.
And the autistic people who you talked about who are more successful, do you think it's true that they don't have mental health issues, or maybe they do and they just are lucky enough to have the support that enables them to get through it or to achieve whatever they do in spite of it?
Yeah, I'm sure both are true. But I've met autistic people who become employers themselves and want to create jobs for autistic people. There's a man in the States called John Robeson, who's autistic, and he employs autistic people in his car company as mechanics, for example. And I think there's almost no sector or job where you couldn't hire an autistic person. There's a chocolate company near where I live in Cambridge called Harry Specter's that makes absolutely wonderful chocolates. They sell them in at the high end market, and they only employ autistic people, even autistic people with a learning disability, because autistic people can follow in quite fine detail with precision, what a recipe might need, just like tuning a car engine.
Simon, I know you have a hard stop coming up. Let's jump to the third of the three questions that I ask everybody, just for a very short answer if you'd like. And that is, just to summarize, in your ideal world, how is autism understood and integrated?
Well, I hope we've covered some of that. But in my ideal world, I suppose what I would hope for is that autistic people's human rights would be recognized, and it's not a big ask. Everyone else's human rights, we take it for granted that they're entitled to things like the right to work, the right to education, the right to protection under the criminal justice system, the right to health, the right to leisure, lots of basic human rights, the right to dignity. And for many decades, autistic people's human rights, I think, have been violated. The autistic people have fallen outside of these basic human rights. So I hope, that the future brings a sort of an increase in autistic people's rights, but it's down to all of us in society to make sure that that comes true.
Yeah, and to adopt this understanding based on neurodiversity, this acceptance, and this almost curiosity and welcoming of autistic people rather than marginalization.
Yeah, exactly.
Simon, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you again. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too.